Hey there, I'm Scott, and this is Tangents. Well, this is actually my second time recording this one, and generally speaking, if I have a technical issue and I record one, I won't re-record it. But this one I kind of wanted to have video for, and for some reason, which I don't quite claim to understand, the video capture did not work. So I have audio for it. Was going to just put that out, and I seriously considered, honestly, like just putting over a different video with the new audio, partly just as a joke to see if anyone would say anything. I ended up not doing that, and the reason that I didn't was that I talked about some stuff, but I completely forgot to hit on a couple of points that I really wanted to, and nothing like major or super profound, but enough stuff that I was like, fuck it. If the video's not there, I'm just gonna redo it. So today is the 21st of July, 2022. It is crazy. 1734 Arizona time. So I'm recording this after my sort of normal work hours. It's Thursday, so it's actually our no meeting day, which incidentally, I have to say, took some fighting to get to there, but I don't know. Meetings are very important, and I certainly have had, like in the past when I worked at ASU or Intel, depending on my manager, we had sometimes good meetings, but for the most part, shitty, worthless meetings. The guy who, well, I don't want to get overly dramatic, but the guy who basically like stole the director position from me. I don't know if I actually had a chance of getting that, but I think I could have done it. I certainly could have done a better job than he did. But at my last job at ASU, that fucker, just, his meetings were worthless. I mean, I really have to say, it was shy. I had a bad, I had a bad attitude about him anyway, just for various reasons. But certainly, I'd go to these meetings, and every week we would have no agenda, no notes, no action items, all of these things. There was a time when I thought they were stupid and silly. They're so important. And we do, in fairness, in my current company, we have lots of meetings where we don't have necessarily action items or notes or an agenda, but we have kind of an outline of what we're going to talk about. We're not repeating the same stuff every time. We're making progress. So we have those things at least implicitly. And when we do need them, we have them explicitly. One thing actually that my business partner does that I really enjoy and kind of advocate, it's an interesting thing too, because there are PowerPoint presentations which suck and are horrible. But one thing we do is we basically have a presentation for a lot of the bigger meetings that we have. And that presentation has, it's just a few slides. It's not like massive. It's not something which is mind-numbing. But it'll have essentially an agenda on it, the highlights of what we're talking about, and then the next steps. So essentially what I just described. And it makes a big difference. It's a nice record also. You go back through these and you can see, oh, well, 3 weeks ago we talked about this, and now here's where we are, and this is, and a couple of times it's actually been very helpful when a customer would say something and then you're like, well, this is actually what we said, not what you're saying we said. Usually we have pretty good luck with our customers, but every once in a while you get problems, and it's nice to have some kind of a record of stuff like that. It's one reason I'd much rather communicate by email, generally speaking, than by voice or iMessage or something, because there's a record of it. And you come back and it's like, well, we had a problem with this actually. Somebody gave us a directive. This is years ago now, but somebody said, we basically explained, while we're doing this, we should really do this, and set up this test stuff. And if we do this, it'll save you time, it'll save you money down the road. And the customer was kind of like, well, yeah, but that's expensive, so I'm going to pass on that. And then predictably, you know, it ends up causing problems. And you get to the situation where it's like, you know, you guys should have done this. And it's like, well, you told us specifically not to. It's nice to have a record of stuff like that, and it's annoying when you don't. So anyway, don't want to talk about that shit right now. What I do want to talk about is Jesus. That's the name of this. Yeah, I always feel a little bit weird when I say certain words, and that one doesn't, it doesn't roll off my tongue. I don't know why. Religious words in particular, I feel awkward about. The reason I wanted to talk about this is I live in Gilbert. If you don't have a map, I could put a map on here. If I was so inclined, I should do that. It'd be really nice. But to paint a picture, Gilbert is pretty east of Phoenix. And my now former partner lives a little bit past downtown Phoenix. So it's like a 30 to 40 minute drive from here to there and then back again. I'm very sorry about this. I have literally no time to pause or re-record because I'm flying after this, weather permitting. And so it's just cringy. Someday I will have a sound studio and that will not be a problem. But anyway, I would drive downtown and back, and there's a chunk of, it's interesting, you can kind of gather from what's on the billboards in a specific area, what people think, not necessarily what the demographics are and what people's needs and concerns are, but at least what the people who are paying thousands of dollars for a billboard every month think they are. And I think most people probably, I suspect, if you're spending thousands of dollars on something, you're probably doing some research, so they probably have some idea. And there's this area that I drive through, kind of downtown Phoenix, deep in the sort of old industrial area. Not that we have much of an industrial area in Phoenix, but such as we do. On a freeway called the 17, there's this area, and you see these billboards, and the billboards are all like, Jesus saves. See several of these. Every time, Jesus saves, some religious bullshit. And then you'll see also, and I focused on that one, there's other stuff as well, but that's the one I'm going to focus on. You'll also see things like advertising alcohol. And there are alcohol ads everywhere, don't get me wrong, but weirdly seems anomalously high there. Now maybe I'm just imagining it, but I think there are more there. See a lot of the vaping stuff, see a lot of the cannabis stuff. And again, like I have no objection to people using cannabis or drinking, or religion I have some objection to. But if you need these kinds of vices, I kind of get it. But you see this and it makes me think, like, I don't really want to go down this sort of logical path too long. I'm just going to kind of cut to the chase and say, I think the reason this stuff is there is that people in this area are much more hopeless, probably. It's an economically kind of depressed area. It's a place where historically, it's just been lower socioeconomic status, some racial segregation. Interesting thing about Phoenix, because you can be in parts of Phoenix and you get the impression that it is extremely homogenous. And then you go other places and less so. And it, like, I don't know, some people probably think of segregation as like a current thing. And certainly when you look at the segregation in cities, it is as great, especially in places that are not in the Old South, where there was some effort to make, integration a thing. Places in the North, and Phoenix is not the North, but places that were not the Deep South kinds of areas, tend to have more segregation now than in the sort of pre-civil rights era days, which is crazy, pretty fucked up. And I mean, it's interesting because for years I've been on this NAACP Youth Council as an advisor. And I would have students, and they're like the only black kid in school, or there'll be like a handful in a school of thousands of people. And then there are other you kind of think, well, like, is it just that's the population here? Well, no, there are places in Phoenix where that ratio is completely flipped. So that part is interesting. And I'm not trying to make this all, purely racial. I think it's as much socioeconomic as anything. But either way, in this area, there's a lot of, or at least my interpretation of this, is there's a lot of economic depression. There's a lot of people feeling hopeless and desperate. And hopeless and desperate people kind of turned, and people who feel like either life doesn't have a lot of meaning for them, or they're kind of in need of, I guess it goes back to the hopeless thing. If you feel like you have no path out of a shitty situation, you start reaching for various vices, like the drugs and the religion and all of this kind of stuff. So that's my explanation for why that's there. Now that in and of itself, I don't think is worth talking too much about. And obviously it doesn't, I'm a few minutes in. So for my standard hour or so, it's, like, okay, done. But the thing I wanted to talk about there is a variety of things, but how hollow I feel like this is, and also how trapped I feel like people get into this stuff. I mean, first off, I say this a lot, but always bears repeating. And I think it is important to say because, like, for example, I've talked about this before. I live in Gilbert. A lot of Mormons here, a lot of people in the LDS. And periodically they rotate out. There are like a couple of houses here where they'll have a couple of kids who are, well, kids being like people in their early 20s, who are missionaries. It's kind of weird to have missionaries in the heart of Mormonville, but they have missionaries here. And they're going around the neighborhood. Well, probably not now when it's 42 degrees out, but when it gets cooler, they'll go around the neighborhood, they're biking, and at night, even now. They'll be biking or walking, and I walk a lot, run into them, and you start talking. They're encouraged to be very, I'm not saying they're not genuinely friendly, but it's almost friendly in a way that feels excessive and pressured and off-putting often. But they seem friendly enough. And they start talking with you, and then they kind of get into, you can feel there's like an underlying script they're trying to do. And it's like the standard, like, well, a little bit of chit chat. I mean, you almost can read the paper because it feels like the same kind of script that you might have for somebody who is new to canvassing. Go around, you knock on the door, hi, and then you have some brackets here, and then they have a whole pattern of, One of the things they always get to is, do you ever feel like, hopeless or desperation, or do you feel like life doesn't have meaning? They have a whole series of these things that they rattle off. And a lot of these things, I'm sure, are very common. And in fact, I know. I mean, it's not like I'm speculating on it. I know they're very common. They're things that people feel and experience all the time. And there's a reason they're in the script, right? But every time they ask me these things, I have a certain, and I don't mean to imply that I have like a certain inner peace that, beyond standard or anything like this, beyond just my temperament, is a little bit calm. And I certainly, I did have a bit of an existential crisis when I was in high school. There was a time I thought about, I'm sure I've talked about this many times, but I thought about like the universe and the scale and scope of, like 13 billion years. And you think about, even if there's a heat death or a big rip or something like this, the duration lying before us and the duration that came before us. And you think about also, like, I got obsessed with, like, almost 8 billion people on the planet now. There were a few less at the time, but now, like 8 billion people, 13 billion years, every couple of years, more than the lifetime of the universe, or the current life of the universe, current age of the universe, worth of human experiences. And you think all of the people in history and how much experience that is, and how many, I guess you can imagine, it's hard to really wrap your mind, I guess, around such big things. It's one of the reasons I think people get upset when somebody's or people have a distorted view and they're like, oh, somebody who makes hundreds of thousands or even millions of dollars a year is air quotes rich. And yeah, they have a lot more than the median person. But compared to like a Bezos or a Musk, it's nothing. Like the difference, it's hard to comprehend this because they have so much money that somebody making $1 million a year is proportionally roughly within the error bars of someone making zero relative to a Musk. And it's hard, like it's just a billion is such a big number. It's hard to fathom. You have to, even in my education, I did a lot of like physics and stuff where you learn about very big and very small numbers, and it's something where you actually have to actively train yourself to appreciate and kind of wrap your mind around. Like one big one is like, okay, you're doing microbial tests and you have some culture and you apply some treatment and you want to know how much reduction was there in terms of population after the treatment. And it'll be like, and this is where you get the whole 99.99% of germs are killed. And yeah, that sounds like a lot, but when you have 10 to the 9 colony forming units per milliliter or something like this, and you wipe it down by 4 orders of magnitude, you still have a really big number. I mean, this is how things work with big numbers. It's just hard to, even with those exponential, like scientific notation things, it's hard to really grasp it. Or logarithmic scales kind of help you understand it a little bit, but still, you have to really work and fight it. And it's very much like, magnets are magic. I have a PhD in physics. I have taken graduate level electrodynamics. Have a pretty good idea of how like Maxwell's equations work and how magnetic fields are formed and interact and all of this. And still, I'll hold 2 neodymium magnets in my hands and push them together, and it's just, there's a part of my brain that doesn't, it's like, whoa, that's magic. I know it's not, but there's just a part of your brain that doesn't quite grasp some stuff. So similarly, there's a part of my brain that just struggles to really hold these things, these concepts, these big numbers. And so you think about that, and you do get a picture though. It's like, okay, you know how much your life is. And of course in high school, mine was shorter than it was now, tinier fraction of a blink in terms of geological time, but you know how big that is and how long sometimes things take and feel. And then you think, well, billions and billions of times that, and it's just, it blows your fucking mind. And so I thought about that. I thought about these things, and I had kind of an existential crisis, just like, oh, you're so small and all of this. I didn't have a feeling that I needed meaning. I really do believe that if you're raised, not necessarily with every religion, but a lot of religions give you a certain structure for experiencing and interpreting the universe. And part of that is like this idea that there's a deity out there and there's some purpose in your life and all of this kind of stuff. This is the stuff that these missionaries were touching on. And I never had that. I never had the idea that there's some special meaning in my life or there needs to be some special purpose. So the absence of that has never bothered me. It's never, in fact, it just seems like, of course, why would there be some special, like meaning to anything? And I don't think that's bad either. Yeah, I mean, I do think, you think about in the grand cosmic scale of things, even just on the planet, you're very insignificant. On the scale of human history, your life is very insignificant. You're probably not going to be remembered past a few generations. Even if you're someone like Einstein, it goes a little bit longer. But if you're someone, like if you go back thousands of years, how many people do we know? You go back 10,000 years, there's a certain point where there were still a lot of people, but basically no, we don't know any individual history, even on a sort of cartoon level. Um, and you don't have to go back that far. So it's quite, fine for me, that actually. And I think like this existential crisis I had was, at first I was like, whole, you kind of start thinking, I wasn't thinking life was meaningless, but just it's like so big and it kind of fucks with you. And also like, oh, the universe is going to go on a long time without you, and it went on for a long time before you, and it fucked with me. And then I was kind of, I don't want to say like a calm washed over me at some point, but kind of something happened. I don't know what happened. I thought about it and thought about it. I wouldn't quite say meditated on it, but you think about it, and then at a certain point you're like, I'm actually okay with that. And I got, I don't think I necessarily have some kind of magical wisdom about it, but I just kind of got an acceptance of it in some sense. So, I'm walking down the street and you get these people talking to you and they're like, well, don't you ever feel these things? Don't you ever feel this need? Don't you ever feel this hole inside of you? And I'm like, no, I don't. I really genuinely don't. And I actually, like, I'll go a step further, and because I know what you're trying to sell, I actually take a lot of, I get a lot of peace from the fact that I was raised without religion. I am thankful for it every day. I find like the fact that that I didn't have that nonsense just like sculpted into my brain when the cement was wet. I'm very grateful for that. I don't know if I told my mom this, but I'm very thankful for you for not raising me that way. And you just think about it, and it's like, because the thing that's weird about it, I don't know if it's weird, but people who are raised with that stuff, even when they leave religion, for the most part, even if they start going like, all that shit is nonsense, blah blah blah, they still have a kind of mystical, magical thinking, sort of wooey part of them. Because I think your brain, when you're starting to develop an understanding of the world and your epistemology is really crystallizing, if you start thinking of things in that way and you have this kind of mystical explanation for things, even when the particular one that was there gets thrown out and you're like, this is ridiculous, you still kind of think of the world in those terms. And so I think this is why you get people who are like, well, I'm not religious, I'm just spiritual. And you see that and you're like, okay. This is also, I think, why you get so many people who are into tarot cards or astrology or this kind of stuff. Because they were raised with a certain kind of thinking. And if you're raised with that, it's very hard to leave. I'm not saying it's impossible, but it's extremely hard. If I was raised with that, would I have escaped it? I don't know. I'd love to think so, but it's one of those things, like if you're indoctrinated into a system, it's much easier to think that you would be able to overcome it than to actually do so. It's one of the things, like, I talk about ACAB all the time. All cops are bastards. And I get people like Gil saying, that means all cops, right? You can't be all cops. Well, the thing is, it's not. Individual cops are not acting as individuals. They're acting as part of a system. And that system is set up, and it's self-reinforcing, to essentially make them bastards. And the thing is, even if you go in with good intentions, you'll become a cop, and in the process of getting there, in the process of starting and having your partner, and you have this whole community that you have, it's very hard to be there and watch somebody, and I'm not saying I don't judge people for doing this, but you see that guy with his knee on somebody's neck, literally murdering them in front of you. I think in that situation, if you're in that environment and that culture, it's extremely hard to be the person that's going to stand up and say, stop that shit. You're killing him. And I'm not making excuses for these people, but it's one of the reasons I think all cops are bastards, because Even if you went in thinking you're not a bastard, even if you're like, you're Bob, that's my friend Bob, he's not a bastard. That's my dad or my mom or my wife or husband or whatever. They're not bastards. Well, yeah, they are, because they're going to sit there and they're going to be, even if they're not the person with their knee on somebody's neck, they're going to be the person standing by watching it. They're going to be the person not telling anyone, not stopping that shit. They're going to be the person respecting the thin blue line, because they're in this system. They're part of a system. And that system does not tolerate people, actually sticking their neck out. If you were the weird person who actually did stick your neck out and say, stop that, one of the reasons that people don't say stop that is because, who knows, would you be successful? And then what would the consequences be? One of the reasons people don't speak up is, if you're the person blowing the whistle on the cops, the people you're blowing the whistle on probably are not going to face consequences, because the system doesn't really permit people. I mean, obviously in this one example, dude actually got convicted, but this is the exception of the exception that proves the rule. I mean, generally speaking, you can do shit like that. They get put on administrative leave, if there are any consequences at all. They get put on administrative leave, which means paid vacation. And they go off, and maybe there's an investigation by other cops. Never can it be like a civilian independent oversight board or something like that. It's always people who are like closely connected to them. And then it's like, okay, that was cool. That was a clean shot, a clean kill or whatever. So just move on. Or I mean, maybe they get fired, but then they get another job as a cop someplace else. It's very rare, exceedingly rare, that they get charged with anything. It's exceedingly rare that they get prosecuted. It's indicted or prosecuted. It's exceedingly rare that they're convicted, if any of that stuff happens. So, it doesn't really encourage people to stick their neck out. And the thing, at the same time, the person who stuck their neck out gets completely drummed out. They get castrated. They get ejected from their social circles. They're shamed. They're abused by the other cops. Similarly, and the reason that I get into this is like religion. One of the reasons that, I actually know somebody who went to grad school with me and was raised on the LSD. He was a Mormon, LDS. But he was raised with that, and I never would have expected this would have happened. But I was told by another friend from grad school, actually I was going to say just a little while ago, but it's now been like half a year ago. But I was told that he left the church. He's now an atheist. And the thing about this, I'm stronger than an atheist. I'm not religious, because to me, atheism is an answer to a question that I don't think is a reasonable question. But still, going from being religious to that, or even just being agnostic, I find very impressive. And I think much more so than just myself not having a religion, not being raised with one. I wish more people weren't. I think it'd be a better world. I really don't think you can be moral or ethical when you're, and obviously, I speak about religion. I'm generally speaking of kind of like Judeo-Christian traditions, and then really you're probably mostly talking about Christianity and Catholicism and all the ones that I get super confused about, what's the difference between all of these things. But all of these are like the dominant one here. They're the ones I know the most about. They're the ones that base morality and all of this kind of stuff on reward and punishment. There are other religions that do that too, but they're specifically really bad at it. And I don't think these people can be ethical or moral people, just fundamentally. And I think this is one of the reasons also why you get so many of these Republicans who are big Bible thumpers, and they sit there and they talk about how godly they are and how much they'll even evoke Christ and all this kind of stuff. Jesus, And the thing is, I am utterly non-religious, not from your tradition, any of this stuff. I would say that I'm probably a better adherent of the tenets of their religion than they are. I'm a better follower of many of the morals and ethics that their, you know, savior guy was supposed to have espoused. Yeah, and it's not because I'm religious or because I'm, following these. It's because I have my own moral and ethical code. Now, granted, I was raised in a civilization that had a lot of that stuff in kind of the environment, so I'm sure part of it comes from that. But I think also part of it is just almost innate and human. I mean, just like I do think humans have a need, not necessarily for meaning in the big sense, like in the sense of, like spiritualism and like having a purpose in your life that's bestowed upon you by some invisible dude in the sky. I mean, I think people have a need for feeling like what they're doing matters. They have a need for feeling like if I don't do what I'm doing, then there will be bad consequences for myself or for people that I care about. And like I'm helping change things. They have a need for feeling like they have some kind of. I think this is actually just a general property of sentient systems, that there's a need for having agency. Like, you're not on rails exactly, which is an interesting thing. I mean, I'm not going to get in a discussion about causality and free will and all this kind of stuff, which I do think are concepts. I mean, this is one of these, I've talked about this as well, but these are concepts that I think like you have an intuitive sense of them. Well, maybe not you, but most people have like an intuitive sense of a lot of these things. What is it to be alive, for example? People have an idea that makes sense, that is a term that refers to something that is concrete and has a good definition. But the thing is, when you start teasing it apart, it really just falls apart. When you start trying to, I mean, alive is a common one, but you start coming up with like, what is a definition of alive? And then you realize, oh, well, this is basically, like you start throwing down things and you're like, well, it metabolizes, it can reproduce, it can do that, and then the classical example is like, well, fire satisfies all of those things. And then you're like, that's interesting. It's one of the reasons why people debate, they get in these weird debates about are viruses alive or not. And to me, it's just a meaningless question. Similarly, actually, to, are you an atheist? It's like, well, is purple flight? I mean, it's just like throwing together words that the words have a meaning, kind of, but although atheist, I don't think, I really, I've talked about this. I should just not say that. Obviously, anything that I talk about, I've probably said something along the lines of before. So just assume that. But when I was young, I was raised not with religion, but I was raised partially on Star Trek: The Next Generation. I watched this show, and you watch this, and they have this character Q in there, and Q is essentially omnipotent, omniscient, by any reasonable definition in sort of at least the Christian traditions and probably many other religions, basically godlike, but certainly not a god, And you think about this, and to me, is like just like a member of a very advanced civilization. It's very, and that's kind of the framework that I would have. This is why I get to the idea of like, I don't think even the concept of a god makes sense, because what is the difference in principle between anything that you might propose and just somebody who's in an extremely advanced civilization or has a deeper understanding of the universe than you, has a deeper technology or capability? If somebody, you can imagine someone evolves to fly. Is that bird that can do this thing magical? No, it's evolved in a certain way. It has a capacity that you don't have. If they had the ability to just snap their fingers and move you by 1,000 miles or to the other side of the universe, or to pop something in or out of existence, anything like that, does that make it really special? And I mean, don't get me wrong, you can respect the capability, and I'm impressed by the fact that we have planes and computers and things like that. I don't think that makes you a god by any means. And if it did, I mean, what does that even mean? It's just kind of like a meaningless term. Similarly, like the spiritual plane and all this kind of stuff, you always think like, well, okay, either it's something that we actually couple to, it's actually like something that you're connected to physically, and it has influence over the physical world, in which case it's really subject to not necessarily the same laws of physics that we would understand, but some kind of laws of physics, and probably, I mean, Noether's theorems and all these kinds of things, you probably don't have a lot of room to have something that's just wildly different. So probably like another field or whatever, and you kind of think, well, okay, so that's like some other fundamental force or fundamental something. Or doesn't have any coupling to that stuff at all, and then it's like, well, is it meaningful? If it doesn't have any coupling, then, like there's no influence, certainly in the direction of that to you, then how is anything that you do different than just an automaton that had no free will or conscious or any of that stuff? And again, free will, conscious, all of that, a lot of words that fall into the same category that you feel like they have a meaning, and then you start teasing them apart, and it's like, well, and I'm not saying that these are not adjacent to actual concepts that do have some kind of concrete meaning, but a lot of them are things where it's like you have the wrong abstraction. You have the wrong, you've sliced the problem in the wrong way. I'm always amazed in physics. So I went to Florence, and in Florence they have the Galileo Museum, and there you see all of these experiments that he did, and these are like all the classical physics experiments, like the inclined plane, the pendulum, like all kinds of stuff. Like you just see them and you're like, oh yeah, I know this stuff. And one of the things that you realize about this, it'd be funny if the pendulum wasn't there, but they're certainly the inclined plane and a lot of stuff that you would do in like an introductory physics class. And these are things which you do in physics, I don't think because there's something massively amazing about them, so much as we have found the right coordinate system, the right framing for these problems, that they're very simple. Yeah. If you put like polar coordinates on an inclined plane and you try to do something and you put the center in the wrong place, that trajectory in polar coordinates is doing weird stuff. And there are certainly physics behind it. And you can write down differential equations that describe like the equations of motion and all of this. But having just the plane, the angle, the position, and a couple of things like this, and you put it in the right framework, it's very simple. It's one of the reasons why we have these problems, why we understand things in these ways. Similarly, actually, like I mentioned, the pendulum actually becomes an extremely complicated, and especially when you start doing like double pendula and stuff like this, but even just a single pendulum on a real string, rather. It's very complicated, it's very nonlinear, but if you have a small displacement, and that small displacement is in the linear regime, where that linear, basically like sine of this angle is roughly the angle. It's a very small angle. And the tension on the string is like, it's not something that can stretch particularly, it's just like a perfect spring, or perfect string. I don't know why I keep saying, technically, I mean, a spring and a string are kind of similar. It's just like the string is an infinitely tense spring, or a spring with an infinite constant so that it can't be expanded. But every real thing is kind of a spring in a weird way. And it gets also to these concepts, like, you have the right concepts and you can understand things in a certain way. Now, those concepts are never perfect. Like I just said, everything is a spring. Not really, obviously. But if you take, like a steel rod and you make it many kilometers long, at a certain point, there's a certain length where that thing, however rigid it may seem, that piece of rebar that seems like it's completely rigid, you make it long enough and you go to the ends and you're on the right time scale and you start waving it around and it's like a fucking like noodle. I mean, it's a weird property of stuff. You're at the right scale, and both in terms of time and space, things behave very differently. I mean, this is another thing, like you see fast, time-lapse photography or stuff that's in like high-speed photography, and you see the dynamics change and often are not really what you'd expect. So, I mean, like, the classical one of hitting a golf ball and watching that ball get squished and spring back. That's not what you would expect, because you hold a golf ball in your hand and you squeeze it a little bit and it seems really rigid. I mean, But anyway, getting to this stuff. I think having the right concepts helps you understand the problems. And I think, well, anyway, I don't really want to get into that. It's like a tangent of a tangent. So get back to this stuff, because I do want to converge in, well, shortly, because I need to get wrapping up. I'm looking at the time. The thing about these things, like whether it's police or being in one of these cults, you're not just acting as an individual, you're acting as part of the system. And part of being part of that system is that, you have friends and family. And when you see this, I mean, I have a couple people on Twitter that I follow. I'm kind of like, I don't know if friend is the right word, but friendlier than just a electronic acquaintance, but not quite a friend. Friend is a more, although also there's a concept, but it's pretty much any English word falls apart at a certain point, but never mind that now. People that I know, and I see them and they're religious, and it's like, you kind of want to say like, this is all just nonsense, but then you see pictures of like, oh, they're with their friends and they're a group of people who are from their religion, and you understand why it's so hard for people to leave, because if you leave that nonsense, I mean, I'm weird in the sense that I have some social needs. It's not like I'm totally asocial or antisocial, but I don't have the need for just, and especially like when I was younger, there was a time when I wanted to like hang out with people much more and didn't care that much, and just wanted to go to parties or go to, hang out at Four Peaks when a bunch of people went. Now it's like the right people I do want to hang out with, but like Gil, definitely motivated to hang out with. A lot of the people that I would have hung out with in the past, it's like, eh. And even at the time, I was kind of not enjoying it that much, but I was kind of tolerating it because I felt like there was some hole there, so to speak. And I think this is one of the holes that religion fills for a lot of people, because, and it's also one of the traps, because, if you're a cop, all your friends are cops, all the people you know are cops, all the people you interact with are cops, and all this kind of stuff. It's really hard to violate that thin blue line and, say like, that dude killed that dude, and I was there and I tried to do something, but I couldn't because, and all this kind of stuff. If you're in the cults, then you also have all these other cult members who are your friends and your family. And leaving the cult means not just leaving this whole framework, this whole understanding of the world and the universe, and also that framework comes with feeling like you're special and like this omnipotent, omniscient being who created the universe, created you just to fill a special purpose that, they thought about you, and they like, I guess I can understand why people find that appealing. It sounds like nonsense to me, and I would actually be bothered by it, because it feels like, I would much rather not have somebody external telling me what I should value and what should be my purpose in life, so to speak. I think it's nice to have a purpose in life, or to have, I don't think you have one purpose. I mean, my way of seeing it is kind of, life has whatever purpose you instill into it, and whatever purpose you give it. And your life matters, certainly, to the people around you, to your friends and your family. You can have a big impact on a lot of people, and they can have impacts on a lot of other people, and so on. Doesn't mean that you had some cosmic significance that, like, you changed the course of human destiny, although at the same time, things do ripple out. So, probably any person who has contact with any other person, a few ripples out, they could say something, and certainly in our society, that can propagate across the world pretty fast. Even in societies before we had like the internet and satellites and all this kind of stuff, there were limitations, but some information could move pretty quickly. And so people could have influence that extended far beyond their ability to see or perceive or interact with people. But anyway, I get the, and I get also like the appeal of the various drugs. I mean, I use caffeine pretty much every day. I get a mocha. I'll have alcohol every now and again. Not really impressed with it. Have never tried cannabis, weed, whatever. I may someday have like an edible or something. It's like I'm not completely shut off to the idea. The main interest I even have in doing it though is just kind of to demonstrate to myself or anyone else that, like, well, yeah, it's not really that amazing, which is what I suspect is. I mean, like the first time I had alcohol, it was shocking how, and this doesn't just go for the first time, but every time I've tried it and to any level of drunk that I've been, it's not really surprising. Like it's not like it was mind blowing or completely mind altering in any way. It certainly impairs your judgment and changes the way you think and feel and all this kind of stuff. But it was within the framework and within the range of things that I could imagine or extrapolate very easily. Now, there are certainly things like hallucinogens that may deviate from that a little bit, but I suspect not. I enjoy hearing stories that people have on these things, but I have no real particular compulsion to try them. Like, and you hear about like hallucinations and this kind of stuff from these. It's like, okay, it's an interesting story. It's kind of like meh to me, but I do get why people want to, like, if you're in a bad situation and you need an escape, then these things are appealing. And then also, of course, alcohol and a lot of other drugs. It's not just like religion and being a cop. They have a social component to them. So it's not just that and I used to go, I mean, even when I wasn't drinking at all, I would go to the bar and go to Four Peaks with a bunch of people. I'd get a bunch of iced tea. And I still do that actually, if I'm not with a bunch of people, but occasionally go to Four Peaks and have a bunch of iced teas. But I can understand a lot of people feel pressure, like you go into that kind of situation and you're like, oh, I need to drink just to keep up with people. And certainly also, I mean, I will say, if you're at a party and a bunch of people are drunk and you're not, your capacity to enjoy that situation is somewhat limited. Because people are not, like, if you're also intoxicated, you can overlook some stuff, but there's a lot of stuff where people are like, okay, this is not really, like, okay, I get it, yeah. Take care, enjoy, get the fuck out. But I do see like people have these needs and they have an unsatisfying life. It's one of the reasons why, like, I know there are problems obviously with like Maslow's hierarchy is not perfect and it doesn't, but as an approximation, something like that kind of makes a lot of sense. And it's one of the things, like, to me, I think society and especially like government and all this stuff should really, the main role should be to fulfill the basic needs, the physiological needs, the safety, all this kind of stuff. Give you an environment where you can have your social needs met and give you an environment where you can be safe and comfortable. And certainly, like, we could have housing for everybody. Not that hard of a fucking problem, really. It's not like this is like splitting the atom hard, and certainly not like it's building a warp drive or something that we barely even can think about. It's it's a solved problem essentially. It's just the will to do it, which is a depressing thing because in Deep Space Nine, I watched that after The Next Generation, I guess partly overlapping, when I was a kid, and they have a thing where they go into 2024, the past, and they have the Bell Riots, and they have these sanctuary districts. 2024 is just a couple years from now, which is crazy. Actually, less than a couple years from now, really. But they have these sanctuary districts where they've basically taken all the homeless people, unhoused, and put them in behind walls where you can't see them. And people now, I mean, it's weirdly like almost feels a little bit prescient that this was a massive problem and social inequity was just getting worse and worse and all this kind of stuff. And you can see how bad of a thing this is. I mean, it's always been bad, but it's now particularly so. And there's no safety net and all of this stuff. And instead of having these kinds of districts, like people are just content to push people off into the fucking desert or like let them die. Which I mean, it's funny because like in Deep Space Nine, you watch that and you're like, shit, that couldn't really be like people couldn't be that fucked up, could they? It's like, yeah, actually, in fact, not only were they that fucked up, the need for having a sanctuary district concept to make people feel okay about, you know, fucking over a bunch of people. No, we don't even have that. We're like, yeah, just drive by a bunch of homeless people, unhoused people, and yeah, it's like, that's just the way things are. We're not gonna, as a society in the wealthiest country in history, I got in an argument with somebody about that incidentally, but we're very wealthy, whether you want to call us the wealthiest. And there are lots of different measures. So like you can look at GDP or GDP per capita, or, you know, if we're not the wealthiest by whichever measure you pick, we're either the wealthiest, we're one of the wealthiest, like the top 8, depending on different metrics. I like to say the wealthiest because it's not totally false, and it's also like more dramatic. But if we're the 8th wealthiest, one of the wealthiest presently and in history, and yet we can't take care of people. We can't provide basic needs that, again, are extremely easy to do. We have way more food, way more energy, way more materials, way more houses, way more apartments and things like this are built than we need to house everybody. And yet we don't do it. We make a volitional choice to let people starve to death and be out in the elements and exposed, and, you know, like let people just be basically fucked over. And you can understand in that kind of situation, it really does disappoint me that people like, at least you can understand the like comfortable fiction of a sanctuary district. Like people could pretend that they're trying to help people, and now the reality that like people aren't even doing that, it's very disappointing. Similarly, actually, like the fucking pandemic, you know, like people can't wear a goddamn mask. Like it's so much of an ask to wear a mask to save somebody, or even more to get fucking vaccinated. And including, like, there was just a polio case in I think it was New York, and yeah, we have fucking polio vaccines. We've had these things since Salk and Sabin, and this is a disease that, you know, it's not eradicated, but it's easily could be on the way out. And yet we're letting this stuff, like it's like a deliberate decision to go back to some of the worst parts of our history. And it's just like, yeah, it doesn't need to be that way. So anyway, you understand, or I understand why people get into this stuff. I do feel like it's a symptom. Like if you had a society that actually housed people, that gave them food and shelter and clothing, and let them, you know, like not only had like K through 12, and not just education in the sense of vocational training, but like really a full, rich education, including arts and sciences and math and history and English or literature or whatever, you know, kind of the classical liberal artsy kind of thing. And then also go on to college. And in college, you don't have to have a job while you're doing that. You can just focus on your studies, and you could pursue different things, and kind of, you're not there to make money in a few years. You're not there taking money from yourself because you're losing out on some opportunities. And that's not an opportunity cost thing. It's not an ROI calculation. You're there to enrich yourself. And also, frankly, I mean, if you want to get to a selfish perspective of this, you're there to make society better because you're going to vote. You're going to be a person who makes decisions and who does things, and having an understanding of philosophy of law, having an understanding of why art and architecture are important. If you're making calls on stuff that's going to get built or not, it's nice to have some understanding of aesthetics. It's nice to have some understanding of social goods and things that are essentially, you know, hard to meter. The things that are hard to limit, like things that you can't say like, oh, I'm going to build these lights and I'm going to have special glasses so that I can use the lights, but nobody else can benefit from them. It's like, yeah, there are reasons why we have these kinds of things. It's one of the things also that drives me nuts because like I can go on the roads and they're not toll roads. They're free. I mean, you pay taxes for them, but that it's worth the fucking taxes because you can, I mean, it'd be nicer if we had walkable cities and public transit, but even absent that, like having the roads is a nice public good. Having sidewalks is a great public good. Having a free internet connection would be a great public good. And then it's just like everything has to get transformed into ways to make money. This is one of the reasons our healthcare system is so fucked up. If you actually like tease it apart, it's very complicated and fucked up in many different ways. The same with education and a lot of other things. But when you get to the root cause, a lot of it comes down to individuals making very selfish, short-term choices for their own personal gain, trying to enrich themselves maximally in the short term again, and without thought for how it impacts other people. It's one of the reasons why the climate catastrophe is happening and we're not doing fucking anything about it. But anyway, with that, it is 18:30, so I've got to start wrapping up. Man, thank you, and as always, Zaijian.